We are very close to ending the session on user stories. We had one left, and it is a particularly challenging one that has come up that we've had many discussions with at different points in the process. So I do want to pick that one up and see if we can't get to a good place with that particular one. And then we can talk a little bit about where we're going to go next. So just to jump right in, sure,
Lynette,
go ahead.
Can I make a suggestion for another item on the agenda?
Yes.
I was really wondering for a couple of weeks now whether in the provider user stories we should add an item on the triple store or the database in which we want to store our data, and whether it's necessary to have a triple store or whether we need to support Sparker queries, or what is necessary for a provider.
I think that's an excellent one to add on. So I will put that on there, and we can, I'm actually going to copy that into our user stories because I think that that is a user story on the provider side.
Okay, thanks.
And that'll be a good place for us to take some notes about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Does anyone else have something else they would like to see added to the agenda? You can always, so the next part after we finish this up will be sort of an open discussion. And so if you have some thoughts at that point, we can always add something in there. So the place we left off, and the one that we have discussed quite a bit, is about the concept of a representative label. And so just to sort of recap where we've talked about this before, for some authorities, representative label is pretty clear. If you're talking about subjects, it's the label for the subject. If it's a person, it's the person's name. But there are other authorities where that is really less clear what that would be. For example, for ISNI, is it the ISNI number, or is there some other way to associate a human readable label that identifies what that ISNI label is about? And so I guess there's a question on the table of, do all authorities have the potential to have a representative label? How does that get defined? So this is really from the provider's perspective, because I would say from the cataloger's perspective, there's pretty much always a need for some kind of meaningful label that allows them to make a selection. Or I suppose it could be, I'm just trying to think out loud here, so bear with me if I'm being a little tangential in this. There's also the potential that the extended context is what provides the meaningful data that can be selected. So I really want to just kind of open this up for folks to talk about their thoughts on this, because I don't feel like we really necessarily got to a good place the last time we were talking about this.
Actually, as a matter of fact, I would not like very much to have a preferred set of elements from the entire data structure for instance, an ISNI record. I would much prefer a solution in which on the query side you have I don't know, a CSS, a style sheet or something that selects from the response by the authority provider all the fields that you're interested in.
I wonder if you could say more about that, because I didn't quite capture your meaning of saying that there would be some highlighting with CSS.
Well, I would like the provider to provide all the information about the entity uh, at once in a response, and I would like the API, the query API, to select from that response the information that's relevant at that moment.
So when you say query, you'd like the query API to select relevant information, are you, in that case, do you mean like the developer who, the code that actually made the query?
Yes. So if in the query you enter, say, a nationality or a language or a script, then you would get the results from the response that agree with your query.
So I'm wondering, maybe someone from the developer side could talk about this. How would the application know, like, that what is the relevant information? Because I would think that would be different for each authority. And so what would be the process by which they would know what would be the right stuff to highlight?
Well, maybe I'm being too simple in how I think that this is going to work. But if you're a cataloger and you want to catalog the author for a title, you will be searching for names. And so if you want a specific author for which you know that he's written a book in a certain year, maybe, or he has written in a specific language, then you know that you want to retrieve the information from the ISNI response that contains that data. And as far as I'm concerned, the ISNI number is the primary key, but it doesn't mean anything.
Right. I definitely would agree with that last statement because that's the kind of thing that kind of trips me up is like, so on the QA side, for example, usually there's something configured that says what's the primary label, and the ISNI would end up being the identifier, and then you would have some sort of human readable label, and that's what gets passed on to Sinopia. And Sinopia is just kind of dumb about this. It just takes that label and just shows it to the user. And so it doesn't have the context of knowing that the user was searching for an author. Now that doesn't mean that there can't be changes to make that happen, but that's the kind of thing that's a stumbling block.
But on the other hand, well, we've had this discussion before with the language discussion, makes it hardly possible, except when you only think in terms of English, to find the preferred label without having some context.
I think it's also confusing in terms of, like, even if you're taking language out of it, I can, think of ISNI examples where choosing amongst the various labels that are available would be kind of arbitrary and might not be what people expect. And maybe I'm overthinking this, but it does seem that catalogers coming from a more traditional, like, LC name authority environment might, if they see an inverted in order name from ISNI, they might not recognize that it's non-unique, that it's not a unique authoritative string. And, so having other distinguishing information, even if it's not a ton of context, would make sense. Just choosing a name seems, I don't know, oversimplifying at best. And I feel like there are ISNI entities where some of the names just would seem counterintuitive to use. So I'm not sure how you'd pick.
Um, so I'm curious, how does, because like if I search at ISNI and I get search results, it does list labels in the search results. So how are you getting the labels on your end for the search results?
Well, we have a preference list, and the preference contains the language. And so English language names will be preferred to other names. But I must say, especially since this discussion, I wonder whether that's the right way to go. It would be much better if you can specify first you maybe you search for a name in a specific language, and it finds the system finds hits, and you see there is more than one hit, and then you'll need extra information, and you might use the response from ISNI to check which information is actually what distinguishes the two names from one another, or the multiple names. You cannot really tell beforehand.
And is that because ISNI has a wider variety of potential data that could come back, such that which field, excuse me, which field would show this information might change depending on the context of what's returned?
Yes, well, we have very many optional elements in our data structure, and it's hard to predict beforehand which elements are more likely to allow you to disambiguate between the various records.
So Jeremy, I'm curious from the Sinopia side, based on some of what's being discussed, do you have any thoughts about this?
I mean, to me, it'd be sort of extending the configuration if we wanted to sort of describe what's coming in by authority. I'm not sure that we would want to add it anywhere else because it could vary, right? But I mean, I think if the API was maybe rich enough, we could query the API for some of the optional elements. But yeah, I'm not sure how we could do it sort of universally, if you will.
Yeah, I'm sort of wondering if, on the Sinopia side, do you know what kind of data you're searching for? So like, do you know you're searching for an author, and therefore you could potentially, because I'm thinking about how we could configure something like this, because we could do a configuration where there's multiple configurations for ISNI. There's a author focused
Sure.
configuration, in which case then the authoritative label could be tied to a particular field, something like that.
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. We were sort of doing that already in some ways where I think it's well, I mean for Sinopia, for our internal use, we do have authorities by like class type, for example, like a bib framework or instance. So that would be sort of, I think, extending that sort of concept. I mean, it's still, I'm not sure we get around the problem of, you know, it having varied fields by authority type, or what we want to extract from a particular authority. And again, that would have to be sort of defined by the template creator, because they would have, the template creator would have sort of that knowledge of what specifically they're trying to search for in an authority.
So I wonder if we could leave this here for a moment and maybe talk about some of the other authorities specifically, and then perhaps see a pattern that evolves from the types of issues that are around there. Because I'm wondering about Wikidata also as something that is, there's a lot of different information that's stored there, and so there's a lot of different views of that data, and so I would think a representative label might also be challenging there. So Lydia, I wonder if you have any thoughts on what a representative label might mean from the perspective of Wikidata.
I don't know if in Wikidata the preferred label is possible, is chosen in terms of language. So this means that you can choose the preferred label for your own language. I remember that we discussed something like this, but I'm not sure that this is the main criteria.
So in this case, are you saying that the creator of the Wikidata entry, they identify a preferred label when they create it?
No, I'm referring to the consuming of data. That means when I search and when I retrieve. I don't know if when I use, when I create a data, I can ask to some colleagues of mine to be sure about the fact that when you create something, you can define a preferred label. In my experience, all labels have the same importance. So I don't know how to express, and it's only when you select, when you search, and when you consume something that you can define your preferred label. Otherwise, all labels have the same size. But we can investigate better around this if no other person can answer now.
Just to clarify, I think, I mean, I'm no expert on Wikidata, but there seems to be one primary label for each language code, or for,
Yeah.
you know, by language code, and then there are aliases, but those are, I think the API treats them differently, and the aliases are considered optional when you're creating new items. So there's a little bit of, while like the label that comes up on top for each language is, you know, maybe not authoritative or unique, but there is a little bit of human intervention in that. It's a kind of different situation than ISNI or some other sources, where somebody's put some thought into, you know, what is the thing that we want, you know, a person would, what is the thing that a person would consider like a normal thing to call this particular item. The other nice thing about Wikidata is that it has, at least in the Sparkle queries, you can specify like a language fallback chain, so that if there isn't an English language label, you can, you know, have a Dutch label or a Spanish label or something. Like there's a hierarchy there.
Yeah, sorry, my computer decided to strike and I had to reboot.
Lydia, tell me if I said anything wrong about that.
No, that all sounds great. So on Wikidata, we specifically at the beginning decided to have a primary label per language that we support. But there are quite a few items which do not have a label in any language, or just like in one or two, which is a bit sad. And as a ultimate fallback, if there is nothing, we use the ID. Also as an incentive to add a label. To add a bit to the previous discussion, I think we're struggling a bit on this one because we're looking at this from the provider side, but the user story doesn't have a in order to. So why are we doing this? Which is a bit tricky.
Are you asking what's the catalog or user story that connects up to this particular user story?
I think I understand it, but the one that we're looking at as a provider, I want to provide a representative label for each entity returned in search results, and in order to make all these other things possible.
Yeah, so I think there's quite a few that deal with displaying a label. So like anytime so like at the developer level, they want to provide a widget that the user can start. Right. Generally, what the user starts typing when they want to do a search is some label, and
yeah. So for selecting,
kind of expects to see as they type that in would be labels. I mean, that's generally how people search. They search for words.
Right.
And we sort of identified that, you know, there's several fields that typically are used for the search of a word, and that would be like a primary label, an alternate label,
right.
Things of that nature. And so I think that's where it comes from, is sort of this, you know, this is a human search process, and how do people find things? And
right.
I think there is some recognition, though, in the discussion we're having, is that sometimes there isn't, and there's going to only be an ID, but perhaps the extended context in those cases would serve as the place where they see human understandable information that would help them to make a select.
In what you've been saying, I think there are two different pieces. One is search. I'm trying to find an entity based on some keyword. And for that, in Wikidata, we look at the label, the alias. Yeah, I think those two things. And then there's display, which in Wikidata, we only use the label plus fallbacks if there is no label for. And I think those have slightly different requirements because of that.
So I missed that. You said on search, it's search of the label and search of what?
Aliases, or what you called alternate label.
Yeah. And your fallback was the ID?
Or languages in the language fallback. So for Swiss German, for example, we fall back to German and then to English. And then to the ID if none of those exists. But that's depending on the language you're looking for, what the fallback is.
So I guess what Lydia is saying is that you want your preferred label to have some proof that what you find is what you have searched for, but also you want your preferred label to disambiguate the results. Is that correct, Lydia?
I guess so, but in Wikidata, for example, we have entity pages where you have stuff like country of citizenship, Germany. And then Germany is a link to another entity, which we would show you where we would show you the label in whatever language you view the page in. And if you make a new statement, say you want to add country of citizenship Canada, then you would do a search among different entities, and there we would allow you to search all the labels and aliases.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Well, what comes to my mind is it a secondary query on your first one if you search for the label Canada after you find Germany? Or is it a totally new search?
It's a totally new search.
Okay.
So Tatiana,
Yeah.
is there always a preferred label identifiable for Share VDE? I think of that as like,
Yeah. Yes, we have. We consider all variant forms, so all label at the same importance in the cluster, but we define in any case a preferred label that is useful to present the entity in the portal. So you need to choose something when you publish something. So in the cluster knowledge base, you find one form in the cluster that is considered the preferred form. And the logic is a sort of hierarchical criteria. This means if the form comes from the Library of Congress authority file, this is preferred for all libraries. Otherwise, if no Library of Congress authority file we have for this entity, we go ahead with the VF form and so on, ISNI and so on. So in any case, we need to arrive to define one preferred form in the cluster, so with a preferred label. And we are discussing exactly the same topic in another project that is Parsifal, that is of the Share family, but with the different libraries. And in this case, also in this case, because they don't agree in the defining the authoritative source to decide the preferred label, we are discussing other logics to apply, but in any case, at the end, we will define one preferred label. Also to figure out the use case of this specific project, Parsifal, that is the ability to download the cluster knowledge base in form of authority file in Mark 21. So in this case, you need to decide the preferred label to specify which form become a 100 tag and the other forms that become 400 tags in the Mark 21. So we need absolutely to define one preferred form.
Okay, excellent. That makes life easier.
Yes.
So Nancy, from the mesh perspective, is there always a preferred label defined associated with the various entities?
So mesh is only available, we only make mesh, I should start this by saying, NLM only makes mesh available in English. Mesh is available in other languages, a couple other languages to my knowledge, French, and I think the Dutch have also done it. But we do not approve that, and we don't have anything to do with it. So when we provide mesh to you guys, we are only providing it in English. So that said, I don't know how to add to this conversation, which is why I've been so quiet.
Can I chime in here for a quick second?
Yeah.
So two things. I think with mesh, you do have you have variant labels. So there's at least a decision about which English language phrase or string you would want sort of prioritized to. I forget who was talking before you, but they were mentioning about ease, and I think that's really what I think to answer the so that question, it seems like the reason why we have variant labels is so that that the client doesn't have to make any of those decisions. It's like, it feels a bit like a hot potato. Like, does the data provider decide what label to just out of ease of use of the vocabulary or terms to prefer, or leave it up to the client to decide or go through that decision tree about whether or not it's supporting primarily English language or some other thing. So that's the way I see the discussion, at least so far.
Okay, so in that sense, yes. So mesh. So yes. So mesh is NLM makes mesh only available in English, but we prefer only one label. So while yes, there may be as many as 6 CFROMs, kind of. There is only all those will point to one public-facing label that is the label that we want people to use. Is that answering your question?
Yeah, so from my perspective, that seems like fairly straightforward to work with. So we identify one field that is the preferred label. That's what gets shown to users as the preferred label. And then there might be additional fields where we show the extended context to help them make their final decision.
Yeah.
So that seems pretty straightforward for mesh then as well, that it fits pretty well with sort of the model we've been working with already. I want to kind of, unless there's another comment about mesh. So I would like to jump back to ISNI for just a second to ask the question. So from your side, do you like, I have to admit that part of the reason why I think I have a lot of questions about ISNI is I'm not as familiar with the structure of the records and the ontology used and things like that. And so I'm wondering if on your side, when there's an entity, does an entity have a particular type? Like, this is an entity about a person. And so this ISNI label is about a person, and therefore we, on your side, what kind of entity it is.
Yes, but we have only 2 variants. We have persons and organizations.
Okay. Do you always have a name? I mean, I'm kind of wondering what it is. Is it the language piece of it that makes it complicated because you just don't know which language to display the label in, or?
Yes, we have data from many contributors to ISNI, and we have a preferred label for each contributor. But so we might have a contributor, Copyrus. It's one of our sources, the Russian sources, and they might have the preferred name in the Cyrillic alphabet for a person that has an English name, and for which we also have a contribution from Korea, for instance. So we have as a type 2 types, persons and organizations, and each person and each organization has at least one, but up to, I don't know how many, as many as you like, contributions with preferred names.
So is the complex part is that they get contributed and they have different ontologies, and therefore what the field would be might be different depending on where that information, who contributed that information?
The field is pretty easy to determine, but there are many instances of the same field. So if we choose an English name, that is a choice that we make. But that might not necessarily be good for everyone.
So when you say that the field is repeated many times, is it typically that it's each one is a different language, or is it that different sources have contributed and they might have just a different name for the same person, even if it's in the same language?
Normally, if it's in the same language, the name will be the same. But yes, each contributor has its own preferred name. And so the Chinese ones I can't even read, and the Korean ones, but well, does it make sense what I'm saying?
So let me just say this again, because I think this is what I'm sort of teasing out of this at this point. So there's a field, it's the same field for all persons, but that field may be repeated, and generally it's repeated in different languages. But what is considered primary is a specific language, which may not match the user's language.
What is shown in our short presentation, that's what I now use as the preferred label. You might call it the primary label. That is one of a set of repeatable elements, the preferred name for a certain contributor. And we prefer the one in the short presentation that's for English. Does that make sense? So we have multiple preferred names for our various contributors, and they may be the same language, they may be different languages. We can't tell really, but we can in general see whether the language is English or something else, and we prefer English so far.
So can I ask a question, just because I'm afraid I don't understand? In ISNI, is it similar to kind of, I'm thinking of the Library of Congress name authorities, where the main name might be in English, but then they have all of these, and hopefully I'm not using the wrong field, but I think there are all of these 450 fields where they have the names in different languages. So is that kind of what I'm trying to understand exactly what you're doing. Is that kind of what you're doing?
No, that's not what we're doing.
Okay.
What we're doing is more like in VIAF. VIAF has VIAF identifiers, and one identifier describes one author's name usually, and the author's name has been contributed by Library of Congress, by the National Library of Poland, by whatever library contributes to VIAF, and it's a sort of cluster of preferred names for various data sources, for data contributors.
So I've sort of put in what I think you have been saying. So we have the same field for a type, like a person. It may be in there many times in different languages. There's a short presentation. So I put as the short presentation is for a specific contributor's value. Is that correct?
No, we don't specifically select one contributor, but we prefer names for which we recognize it's English or at least Western European script. It's not like, as Tiziana was saying, we prefer the Library of Congress to VIAF and we prefer VIAF to ISNI. We have no preference in such a structured way. We have a set of names which we sort on the basis of a script, and we prefer the Western European script.
So I'm wondering, so I'm wondering if the challenge is that when someone searches ISNI and you return the data, you're going to return all of the values for the person's preferred name, which could be across many languages, and you are not going to limit that down to your preferred, like what you use as the preferred, which is the English version. You're sort of expecting that to happen on the processor's end, the one who's called the API. Is that an accurate statement?
I would see that as a preferred way to go, yes.
So if that's the case, do you do language tagging on the return values so that I would be able to easily identify which one is the English version?
No, but we are now thinking of a way in which we can give preference to, say, the contribution of Korean contributors if the search language of the search API is Korean.
So when you say that, are you thinking about putting in a parameter that goes to the search API that identifies what language the user wants to see, and then it would be returned in that language if available?
Yes, I think it's going into that direction. With the side note that it's hardly possible to determine the language of a name because the name has no language. It mainly has a script in which it's represented. So Mozart is Mozart, whether it's written in Cyrillic scripts or a Chinese character or whatever.
Right, that brings up a whole nother potential area of discussion that I've had with folks several times around names being, the name is the name is the name, the person has their name, and anything else is a translation of that name purely for the convenience of a particular language.
Well, actually, what we found is it's not so hard to determine using just open source functions to determine the script of a name. And once you know which script you want to use for your data, for your searches and the returned results, then it's not so hard as using a language.
Okay, so I think I'm trying to think through this because we're down to 15 minutes, and
oh, sorry.
No, that's fine. This is really the complex part of this, right? So I think that's why we weren't able to just easily solve it the first time around, and I wanted to have a deeper conversation about it. So I think that a lot of providers do have a preferred label, and so in those cases, this is a fairly simple process. And then I think that sometimes there is a challenge in that language brings in a challenge for it. And then other times it seems like there's even more complexities to it, which that's not really going into specifics, but we've talked about it quite a bit in this ISNI particular case. And so I think one of the questions for me is really what level is best situated to make some of the determinations in the complex cases. And I think that's why I keep coming back to, on some level, wanting ISNI to make a determination about passing back a primary label. Perhaps I need to let this sort of sift through my mind a little bit, and we could touch base on it some more. Do you have something, Kevin?
Yeah, I do. So ID is not on this list, and I only imagine that's because I joined so late. My apologies about that. But what I wanted to say is that ID actually has both situations. For the vast majority of stuff, we do provide an unambiguous preferred label. Nearly everything is labeled as English, including possibly a few LCSH things that don't have English equivalents and might actually exist in some foreign language, but they're treated for all intents and purposes as English. But names, interestingly enough, we do not put a language label on. Mostly because names are weird. You know, Nancy was mentioning earlier that names can be in different languages, and I think that's true in some cases, but the distinction you see at ID often when you see names that are not in obvious English is that it's either just a person's name and it has no language, or it's in a different script. That's what you really get in MARC. And if you're coming from a MARC environment, MARC encodes a script in which something is written, not necessarily a language. In any event, even for names, we provide a preferred one, and then all the rest are variants. But we actually hit the situation where with our BIV frameworks and instances and items, there is no quote-unquote preferred label. It's just a pile of data. Now, if you look at id.loc.gov, we've crafted labels. They're usually called, I think if you look carefully at the data, they might be labeled AAP, which stands for Authorized Access Point, which is an RDA thing we don't need to go into beyond what I just said. But that is a completely constructed label based on the data. It's something that we did mostly for our own convenience, so that we didn't have to compute that label downstream. We knew our editor would connect to id.loc.gov, and we wanted to have a label ready to go. We didn't want to have to deal with, like I said, computing a label from a pile of data. But I recognize that we are in the position to be able to create our own label for our own application in this particular example. But I wanted to just point out that, you know, the moment you start dealing with, you know, so-called real-world objects, there may not be an unambiguous preferred label. And that's what you get with works and instances.
Well, Kevin, what you say makes perfect sense to me. And I was just wondering if it's a possibility if you do some search and you find entities in the database and you find multiple, would it be a solution if you can somehow return to the user how many extra elements are found in your repository that you could use for disambiguation? So your labels don't seem to have a meaning. They seem to be sort of concocted. We have tried to use labels that have some information about the contents of what's in the label. But if you can just make a list of the various labels per item that's returned in the response, that makes it possible to disambiguate. Is that an idea for the way of providing your response?
The short answer to that question is yes. We have resisted that a little bit because the boundaries are not always very clear. You know, how much is too much, how much is, you know, or would we end up providing too little? The way we've gotten around this to date is our label service just provides a label and our label service, our suggest service provides a label and a URI. That's all it provides right now. So what we've done with our editor and our lookups is when you start typing, the back end starts hitting the suggest API and you will see a list of possibilities. But if you take the mouse and hover on top of any of those possibilities prior to selection, the editor will actually take the URI and dereference it and grab some additional data and display a context modal so that you can see more information about that particular entity and whether or not you want to choose it. So long story short is, yes, we could provide more information in the response itself. The way we've gotten around this now is we provide the label and the URI, and then the editor does a second lookup when needed. We found that to be more efficient because we weren't providing more information and we weren't making the system provide more information than was needed at that particular moment in time.
I must say, it seems to make perfect sense to me, the way you do it.
So the thing that I keep coming back to is, in my mind, who makes some of these decisions about what that primary label would be? Do we want that? Part of the reason why it feels right to me to have it happen at the provider level is then it would be consistent regardless of what application tries to make use of that data. Whereas if it comes out to the application level, then each application may make different choices about how that happens. So I'm wondering, after this conversation, Hetty, if you think that ISNI would be able to provide a primary label, or if you still see this as very problematic.
Well, I have a feeling we do. We choose English now, and I think that would work. So I wouldn't see it as problematic.
Okay. So I'm wondering if folks would agree that this is a user story that providers need to be able to provide a representative label. Is there any hesitation in my putting that out there as one of the user stories for providers? All right, so I didn't anticipate this particular conversation taking the entire time, but that's fine. And I think it might even take more time as we move more into some of the language questions. But I'm gonna leave it right there for right now. And I just wanna, because we have just a minute or two left, I do wanna show you the direction I'm going with trying to consolidate the user stories and relate them to each other at the different levels. So I put these into a spreadsheet, and you might have noticed on the other one that they do all now have IDs in this first column, and that was just so I could track things as they got moved around. So I plopped them all into a spreadsheet, and I'm trying to move them around to show what developer stories are related to what provider stories, and also what cataloger stories are related to particular developer stories. So this is actually kind of a, I kind of have to like really think about it and move things around. And so my inclination is to do a first pass on this myself and then bring it back to the group to sort of look at it and see if what I've done makes sense, and have any discussions that come out from that. So I just want to see sort of from folks to get a sense of if this is like a good next direction from your perspective, or if there's any other kinds of things that we want to be able to explore. So we didn't really get to that added on question about triple stores and everything. So I'll leave that on the agenda as well for next time. But any thoughts about kind of what I've started gathering here of relating the stories at the different levels to each other?
I think this is great.
Yeah. Is this the sort of mapping that we discussed some weeks ago?
Yes,
it's sort of mapping. Okay.
Yep, this was suggested at the last meeting we had, and so I wanted to start that process of sort of rearranging them and seeing how do we go from the various levels of the stories and how do they sort of drive each other, and what's related. And I think that might help answer some of the questions we still had remaining even as we went through the user stories.
Yeah, excellent.
All right, so it is 1 o'clock, and I don't want to hold you guys late, but I really appreciate everybody coming. And yeah, I got to go pick up my kid from school.
Okay, so that's really funny.
That is important, I suppose. It's very important.
Yes, yes. He appreciates it if I don't forget him and leave him there.
Okay.
All right. Well, I hope everybody, I guess we'll see you guys in 2 weeks is the plan, because that keeps us out of the holiday week as well. And what I'll do is I'll actually send, when I get this further along, I'll send out a link to it so folks can maybe take a look at it in their own time when they have a chance. And also one other comment real quick before I go, the survey is going to be going out shortly as well to the PCC group. And I will also let you guys know when the data comes back from that. All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.